Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this Kwanzaa set. Now, even if you don't celebrate Kwanzaa, there is still a lot to learn with this set, both from techniques, and I'm going to teach you a little bit about Kwanzaa at the same time. First up is the Happy Kwanzaa cookie, so let me start out by telling you just a little bit about Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa is a 7-day celebration of African roots and is observed from December 26th to January 1st every year. It is observed by people of all faith backgrounds, as Kwanzaa is not tied to any specific religion. It was founded in 1966, so it's not that old, and it was born out of the pain of the civil rights movement, specifically in response to the Watts riots in 1965. And it was created as a way to really empower Black people to rediscover their African heritage and to really concretize the expression of the Nguzo Saba, which is a value system organized around 7 principles. So you'll see here, as I explain a bit more later, but each of these 7 cookies, not this yellow one here, but the white ones, all represent 7 symbols and 7 principles of Kwanzaa. So for this first one here, this Happy Kwanzaa, I am doing a 2 consistency outline and flood because I'm about to do a wet on wet. And I did under flood this a bit. As you can see, there's some gaps because I wanted to make sure there wasn't too much icing in my base. I'm using the scribe to get these corners nice and sharp, give it a little jiggle. And then once that is settled enough and I'm happy, I do need to move pretty quickly with wet on wet. And this is all one continuation of the same decorating. That was just kind of an awkward edit because my cookie left the frame. But anyway, so here I'm just piping with flood consistency, some beautifully straight lines, and you have to move pretty quickly when piping with flooding consistency because it comes out of that bag faster. So you can see I am moving pretty quickly. That's a luxury of piping with a thicker consistency because you can move the bag slower. You need to have a lot of control of your bag to be able to pipe lines with a flood consistency. It's all about knowing how much pressure to apply on your bag based on the thickness of your icing and the size of the opening of your bag. I just love wet on wet is by far one of my favorite techniques because it's just so satisfying to watch the icing sink into each other, and then you're left with this beautiful flat surface of a design. Just love it. Now for piping the lettering. Holy guacamole, this took me forever. I don't often do lettering like this because it is incredibly time consuming, but I was committed and I just made a handful of the Happy Kwanzaa, so it was okay. I survived. But first up, you want to outline the letters with a piping consistency. And this is just like a 2 consistency outline and flood. But there is what I think is, there are a lot of things that are hard about this, but I think the hardest part is that there really is no forgiveness in the outline. Now, sometimes, depending on the lettering and the consistency I'm working with, I will outline one letter at a time and then flood while the outline is still wet. And when I do it that way, then there's a little more flexibility with the outline, so I can kind of massage it a little bit if I need it to be adjusted to fit better. with the shape of the letter. But I found with these, because these were such small letters and there is such precision in the size of the openings of this A, for example, that I needed to make sure that the outline dried before I went in with the fill. I did a test run or two of these letters before I piped them on a cookie, and I found that if I didn't let the outline dry, then sometimes the letters would kind of flood together a little too much, if that makes sense. So the sharp edges and the cutouts of the A kind of disappeared, which is no good. So I'm gonna finish outlining here and I'll be back when I'm done. And you can see there, oopsies, I broke a line. No good, but you just gotta work with it. And now I'm filling this with a thick flood. Immediately after I flooded these letters, I put this in a dehydrator to prevent cratering. I think I did still have one crater. Luckily, I made a few of these cookies, so didn't have to photograph the one that cratered. But this takes a long time, and as you can see, I'm kind of using the tip of my bag to encourage the icing into all the little crevices. Other people may use a scribe, just like flood the letters a little more loosely and then use a scribe to get it into all the corners. But I find that using a scribe takes more time. And if you're working with a pretty thick flood, then by the time you get to a scribe, it may have already started to crust. So there I am using a scribe because I got a little bit too much icing on the corner. But for the most part, I'm just using the tip of my bag to encourage the icing into all the corners, and then I don't have to use a scribe. This lettering that I'm piping is just a soft peak, and I cut a pretty big tip on this because I wanted a thicker size of the letters here. Sometimes this lettering is more stressful because you get one shot to get that line right. And you can see here, oops, my line broke. And I could have tried to connect the lines, but I knew it wouldn't have looked seamless. So what I decided to do was just, as you can see, scrape off the letter and then try again, make sure I'm covering that letter that I scraped. And when I do these real-time tutorials, I like to leave in moments like that when I make a mistake. When I do the sped up satisfying compilations, I take that out so you don't see it. But I feel like with these real-time tutorials, this is the time to show you when I make mistakes, because it absolutely happens, and how I fix them, because a big part of getting better at anything, in my opinion, is just learning how to fix your mistakes, because they're gonna happen always. You just get smarter at it. Here I'm projecting these candles and just using that soft peak piping consistency to pipe out these candles. The projector I will link in the description of this video. So actually I skipped ahead here a bit because I wanted to show you that I finished piping these, and I realized that I piped these candles too short. I didn't really have a good eye with the projector on, so I'm using the end of that plastic scribe to scrape off the candles, just the ones I don't like. I liked that first one. And then position the projector just to the perfect spot. Now, as you can see here, it did actually leave some of the coloring of the icing behind, so I needed to make sure that I was piping exactly on top of the candles that I had scraped off. So again, just wanted to show you an example of how I fix my mistakes. And this here, I'm piping the flames, and what I'm doing is I'm piping a dot, and then I'm releasing pressure and pulling away from the dot so I can get that little tip at the end. And that is the Happy Kwanzaa cookie. And now I am moving on to all of the cookies that I made for the 7 principles and 7 symbols. I did the same exact shape for this entire set. I was trying to accomplish a lot with the symbolism and the principles of Kwanzaa, so I wanted to keep it pretty simple with the shape. And on all of these shapes, I did one of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa and one of the symbols of Kwanzaa. So there are 7 of these principle symbol cookies, and then I did a happy Kwanzaa just to round it out. I did do a 2 consistency outline and flood for all of these plaques. It was just the simplest thing, and I'm doing a lot of wet on wet designs, so I wanted to have the flexibility of a thinner flood. Also, this shape in particular, I find, especially when I'm doing straight edges, I really prefer to do 2 consistencies because I feel like I have so much more control on the outline. So that outline is probably a soft peak piping consistency. I do allow that to crust over before I move on to flooding, which is what I'm doing right now. And this here looks like a slightly thinner flood for me. So the icing is going to roll off the spoon relatively easily when you pick it up from the bowl. And I'm only going to show you this outlining once because you don't need to see this outline done 7 times, right? And if I'm not doing wet on wet, I won't show you the flood again. So get this one beautiful flood. And actually, I only filmed this flood once for that purpose because it's a flood. A flood's a flood. I'm using a scribe here. You can see to get the icing into those tricky corners a lot better. Really make sure it fills out the space. So here I am using a piping consistency. For all of my piping consistency, I'm doing a soft peak here, and that gives me the most flexibility in the usage of the piping consistency. So here, this red here is also piping consistency. This design here is a set of flags. This first cookie is Umoja, which stands for Unity in Black Families and Communities. And I'm piping these flags, like I said, with a soft peak, and then I'm using a scribe to settle them out. I'm doing a single consistency here to prevent craters because this little shape is the perfect kind of shape that is probably going to have craters because it's so small. Craters are when the icing dries and there's a divot in the middle, and sometimes even with like a really small space like this, you could actually have a hole in the surface. Oh, that's the worst. And you don't find that out until the cookie is dry and the ship has sailed, which is pretty sad. So the thicker the consistency that you can use, the better, because there's just more stability in the icing so that it won't cave in and fall through. It does mean it takes often a bit longer to actually pipe the shape because you have to go in consistently and use that scribe. I'm using the scribe after every single flag because maybe I could get away with doing 2 at a time, but since it's a thicker icing, it's going to start crusting a lot faster. So you need to move pretty quickly with that scribe. And I'm probably making it look easier than it is, but you're really, for the most part, just jiggling the surface of the icing. The hardest part probably is just finishing it so that you're not leaving it with any sort of additional peak on top of the icing. So I'm gonna leave you here with these last few flags and I'll come back when they're done. So for this next part, I just wanted to reinforce that black line because it's supposed to look like a banner, and I felt like the black was really disappearing from the flags that I put on there. And you can kind of see I'm lifting that bag off the surface, which, as you know now, is the key to a really beautiful line, whether you want it to be straight or just really smooth. And just for a little add some, I decided to add a second line here. And again, I'm moving pretty slowly, and you can see, again, I'm lifting that bag off the surface, gosh, a centimeter, half an inch, moving pretty slowly because I'm trying to be very precise. And I'm using the same consistency icing here. This is the medium peak. And I have here a font, Shoreline, that I downloaded from the internet, and I wrote all of the words out in Word. And then this is just how I do it. I write the words out in Word, and then I take a screenshot of those words, and then I use my projector. I typically use my iPad and project from my iPad. That's Umoja. And then I paired this with the symbol Kanara, and the Kanara is the candle holder, and that symbolizes ancestral origins. So the candle holder holds all the 7 candles of Kwanzaa because Kwanzaa lasts 7 days. For all of these silhouette images that I did, I am doing a piping consistency to outline, and then I am using a pretty thick flood to fill it in. And I just felt like I had the most control over the shape doing it that way. And you can see in that the right corner, I didn't quite get the shape of the Kanara correct. So I kind of corrected that with the outline. So it's pretty forgiving as long as you know kind of how to work with it. And you may be able to tell this is still a pretty thick flood. If it was too thin, then it definitely would have just fallen off the edge of that cookie. Not ideal. But I wanted the thick flood again, so most likelihood of not getting craters. I think on some of the shapes I got a little bit of craters, but that's fine. And here, using my scribe, I have 3 different scribes that I use predominantly. This is one of them. This is the one plastic one. It actually has a corrector tool on the other side of it, which is why I like it. So that's the first day of Kwanzaa, Umoja. And then up next, we have the second day of Kwanzaa, and this is Kujichagulia. And pardon me if I pronounce that correctly, and that means incorrectly. And that means self-determination. It's the ability of Black people to build their own future for defining, naming, and speaking up for themselves. By defining, naming, and speaking up for themselves. So for this, I am doing a wet on wet design. And I just did those wonky lines because I was trying to eye where exactly I wanted this strip to go. And so I just started with that first diagonal and then made it into a bar. So this is all flood consistency. And I will say that I definitely did not move quite fast enough when doing this, because by the time I get to my scribe pull at the end, it already had started to crust, which is like worst nightmare, but it worked out just fine. For all of these cookies, I only made one. These cookies all range from about like 10 to 15 minutes each. So I just did not have the capacity to make more than one. So I had one shot to get it right. I did sketch all of them out, so I had an idea of what I wanted. And then I just committed and I went with it. When doing wet on wet with a lot of color in it, like I'm doing here, I prefer to pipe it in these color block sections instead of something else I could have done was just flooded the entire surface, under flooded it with white, and then done these colors on top of that. But I knew if I did that with the amount of color I was adding that I would most likely have over flooded the cookie, and that's no good. So as you can see here, finishing up this green line, that second yellow line next to the red got a little too thin. It's being overcome by the red. And so I'm going in here and I'm just adding another line on top. Wet on wet can actually be pretty forgiving. It's just about layering the colors. So I layered that yellow back on so I had more prominent yellow. And here I'm flooding a bit faster. And at this point I'm realizing, I wonder if I've done this fast enough, but no going back now. The only way that you can really correct a wet on wet that has truly crusted too quickly and you can't work with it the way you intended is you just have to scrape the cookie. And even now, every few sets I scrape a cookie because it just didn't go right. So I'm pulling out my scribe here. This is another scribe I have. This is my thinnest metal scribe. And I like to do this for really fine work. It's good for this too, this wet on wet pull, when I know that it's already kind of too crusted, because it's going to disturb the surface as little as possible. And that's good since, especially towards the end, you can see, when you can really see how it's disturbing the icing, you can see that it has crusted. But it's good enough. So going in there with the scribe to kind of try to settle out the little peaks that were left at the end there. And then I think next I'm going to give it another jiggle just to help encourage it as much as possible to settle. And this is where I left it at good enough. So again, coming in here with the lettering, what's really important about this kind of lettering where you're just using one consistency the entire time, like not doing pressure piping, is you do need to be able to lift up that bag from the cookie to get these really beautiful lines. You see this J in particular, I'm really lifting the bag off the surface, because if you don't lift the bag off, you're going to get really jagged lines, and that's not what you want for this. I love this kind of writing where it's just this kind of continuous flow from one side of the cookie to the other. And that's not technically this font. I've just added these continuous lines at the end just to make sure it goes from one side of the cookie to the next. The symbol that I paired with this cookie is Muhindi, which are the ears of corn, and that represents the hope associated with younger generations and for future descendants. So again, as I've done, I'm outlining here with piping consistency, and then I'm going to fill that in with a flood. And now I'm using piping consistency to pipe out the kernels of corn. And something I found that was really good for these silhouettes is where I tried to create some white space so that it wasn't just this mass of black on all of them. So I'm very intentionally kind of leaving some space in between these kernels instead of connecting them all together, because I want you to be able to see the white of the cookie through the kernels of corn. Just adding some extra lines of interest here. I felt like the design needed a little bit of 3D on it. And this is something that I hadn't sketched out. It was just something that I added after I put the cookie together, looked at it, and was like, it could use something else. So I love being able to do that with designs. And that is the second day of Kwanzaa. And we are on to the third day of Kwanzaa, which is marked by Ujima, which is the Swahili word for collective work and responsibility. And this encourages Black people to work together and be accountable to one another. And again, here I am doing my piping consistency, soft peak, to do these beautiful lines. And much like what I did with the flags, I'm using my soft peak here and piping out little dots. And I realized with the first one that I didn't quite get it big enough. So I'm going in here and kind of shaking the surface and adding more icing to the center of that dot. It's a bit of an art to do that, but totally worth it, using my scribe to make sure it's all settled together. And then piping these dots. And I will leave you with these dots and I'll come back when they're done. So the symbol that I paired this cookie with is the mkeka. My apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly. And this is the mat that is used at the center of all of the Kwanzaa symbols and decorations. And this is where everything goes on top of the mat. And this is because mkeka is meant to symbolize the foundation for Black history and heritage. So it is prominently displayed in the Kwanzaa celebrations. So this is a pretty typical design that I've seen where kids can make their own mats out of construction paper with black, red, and green. Black, red, and green are the official colors of Kwanzaa. That is because they are the colors of the Pan-African flag. Fun fact. So here I am piping all of the outline with a soft peak piping consistency. And the key here, again, is to lift up the bag to get these beautiful lines. And this is also where it's important to use the soft peak, because that means that the icing will kind of sink into each other a little better at those cross sections of all of these lines. I find that if you're using too stiff piping consistency, the lines will just like sit on top of each other instead of kind of meld together, if that makes sense. So these are really tiny spaces, like 1/8 of an inch maybe, and this is a classic spot where it's going to crater. So I did a couple of things to try to prevent cratering. The first thing I'm doing here is I'm using that piping consistency to pipe a dot in the middle, and this will help to give some stability to the icing, because I'm going to use a flood after I pipe these dots. And then something else that I did is immediately after I flooded these little squares, I put this in the dehydrator, and the dehydrator helps to speed up the drying process. And what that does to help prevent craters is it crusts that top surface as soon as possible, because it's the top surface that as it dries, it starts to sink in. But if you can get that top surface to dry ASAP, then you're less likely to get craters. It's not foolproof, but for me, it works more often than not. And something else that I'm doing here is probably a lot of people would go in with a scribe to encourage this icing into all of the corners, but y'all, I have limited patience. We know this. I have limited patience. So I'm just using the tip of my bag to encourage it into the crevices as much as possible. And for me, that's good enough. And that is the third day of Kwanzaa. Then up next, we have the fourth day of Kwanzaa, which is marked by Ujama, which stands for Cooperative Economics in Black communities. And this means combining energy and focus to build businesses and economic stability to support each other's economic goals. And here I'm just doing a line lattice of sorts, just layering lines on top of each other. Thought it would look fun. Why not? I should say that there's no significance to the designs that I did in the center of each of these cookies. I just wanted to do something festive and fun. And I added yellow to the colors just to brighten it up a little bit. This is really a test here in piping straight lines. And always I'm doing an initial contact, lifting the bag, and then contact again. Contact, lift, contact. And you want to be really soft with the initial contact and the release. A lot of people struggle with getting a bead of icing at the beginning of their lines, and that is because there is too much icing that's coming out of your bag at the beginning of that line. There's really a balance to the amount of pressure that you need to apply and how quickly you need to move your bag. So you need to apply just enough pressure so that there's icing coming out of the bag, and as soon as you make contact with the surface of the cookie, you pull up. That's the hardest part. I always encourage that you just focus on piping a straight line first, and then you can focus on removing that bead from the beginning of the line, but focus on that straight line. You can see here's a good angle that I'm really lifting my bag off the surface. I paired this cookie with the symbol Mazao, my apologies. This is the symbol for the fruits and vegetables that represent African harvesting traditions, where crops are the rewards of collective work and cooperation. So I just did an apple here to represent fruits and vegetables. Up next, we have the 5th day of Kwanzaa, and this is marked by Nia, which means purpose, and this is about inspiring Black people to build personal and communal dreams and goals to work towards together. This is going to be a wet on wet design, which is why I'm showing you the flood here. And you want to make sure when you're doing wet on wet, where you're layering icing on top of each other, that you don't put too much icing in the initial flood. I always talk about under flooding a little bit. Now, the design that I'm doing for this doesn't add that much additional icing, so I'm not that concerned with under flooding. But at the very least, just make sure that you're not threatening too much icing in your initial flood. And as I've done with just the standard flood, using my scribe here to get those sharp edges as sharp as possible with that flood. Give it a little jiggle to help it settle. And then I will be piping once I get these corners right. I'll start doing the design. And this is all flood consistency. Flood is always going to come out thicker than you might think because it settles more than the tip of the bag that you cut. So just be conscientious of that. I definitely wanted to make sure that I was using a pretty thin tip here. So I actually did these wet on wet designs before I flooded the circles that you see in the full set. For the circles, I cut a larger tip on the bag than what I'm using here. And that's something to think about as you're decorating. If you ever need to have different size tips, instead of having to bag twice, is it possible to decorate your set in an order so that you can use the smaller tip first? Something to think about as you're planning. And so the symbol that I combined with this, and I'm so sorry, I think I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Kuumba cha Umoja. This is the unity cup, and the unity cup symbolizes unity among Black peoples, and it plays an important role in the candle lighting ceremony. As I briefly mentioned, there are 7 candles for 7 days of Kwanzaa, and 1 is lit each day. And that is the 5th day of Kwanzaa cookie. Up next, we have the 6th day, which is marked by Kuumba, and that stands for creativity, and it's about creating things of beauty that strengthen and empower Black people and Black communities. So I'm doing a wet on wet for this. So I'm showing you the flood first. It's gonna take me a minute for this flood. I'm not adding a lot of icing, so I'm not too concerned about underflooding this. But I'll be back when I'm done with the flood. So this one here was really stressful because I was trying to get as straight of a line-ish of possible of these perpendicular lines all the way across the cookie. Now, if I had been doing this, on the surface of a dry cookie, I might have been able to like etch out a line with a ruler with the end of a scribe, but this was wet on wet, so I had to just eye it. And what I'm doing here is just, there's really no rhyme or reason to where I'm piping these lines, but after I'm done with these lines, I'm gonna come back through and pull them with a scribe and do a pretty common, pretty traditional wet on wet technique. Doing pulls through lines is probably one of the first techniques I ever learned. It's a super classic, but it is so effective and such a good one. Now here I am coming in with my scribe, and I'm using my thinnest scribe, and I'm cleaning off after every pull because I don't want there to be any residue of icing from the other pull. And now I'm just going in as the opposite. I love doing this, going in and alternating pulls, because then you get this nice zigzag effect. And I just use the scribe to kind of help encourage the little bits at the end that might have been sticking up because they started to crust a bit. Now, the symbol here is zawadi, and this is about gifts that are placed on or near the mkeka, the mat, throughout the 7-day celebration. And during Kwanzaa, these gifts really represent the fruits of labor and the reward of all of these seeds sown throughout the year. So gifts are certainly a big part of Kwanzaa. Again, here you can see how I'm leaving space in between the sections. And that was because I knew that I didn't want to just pipe this black mass. I also feel like the negative space in between the sections helps you to better identify what the shape is. So that is the 6th day of Kwanzaa, and now we are on to the 7th and final day, which is Imani, and this means faith in Black people, families, and heritage, keeping the faith that the struggle for justice will be won in the end. So for this one, I did give myself a little bit of help, and you can see I used an edible marker. Yes, it's an edible marker to mark out the guide, the line guide, because I'm doing something here which I kind of regretted as soon as I started piping it. I'm doing this kind of knit braided technique with pressure piping, where you pipe you adjust your pressure on your bag as you're piping. So I pipe a bead and then I release my pressure as I start to pull away. It's not a total release of pressure because you still need icing to come out. And typically this is piped with one color, so you can kind of just do a beautiful kind of alternating stroke. But I, for some reason, decided to alternate colors, which is kind of just a pain in the bum because you have to keep picking up a different bag every time. So I'm gonna leave y'all here with my alternating pressure piping, and I'll be back when I'm done. And this last symbol that I paired with this cookie would be the Mushuma Saba, which are the 7 candles. There are 3 red, 3 green, and 1 black. The single black candle stands in the center, and that represents Black people everywhere. The red candles represent the struggle, and they are placed to the right, and then the green candles represent hope for the future and are placed to the left. And that is the cookie for the 7th and final day of Kwanzaa. And that, my friends, is the entire set. I really hope you enjoyed watching this. You learned a few things about cookie decorating, but also about Kwanzaa. Happy Kwanzaa, everyone!